Hey, welcome back to Late Night Psychology. Get comfortable, adjust your blanket, let your body settle into wherever you're resting right now. There's no rush tonight, nowhere you need to be. Just you and the quiet, and some questions worth thinking about. Tonight, we're exploring one of the oldest debates in psychology. Are psychopaths born or made? It's a question that seems simple at first, but the more you look at it, the more complicated it becomes. Because the answer, as best as we can tell, is both and neither, and something in between. What we know is this: when researchers study people who've committed extreme violence, patterns emerge. Not the same pattern every time, but recurring themes, recurring factors, things that show up again and again. Genetics plays a role, brain structure plays a role, early attachment plays a role, trauma plays a role. But none of these factors is deterministic. Most people with difficult childhoods don't become violent. Most people with certain genetic variants live perfectly normal lives. So what tips the balance? What combination of factors creates someone capable of terrible things? Tonight, we're going to explore three cases, three very different childhoods, three very different pathways. The first case will look at what researchers call secondary psychopathy, the idea that psychopathic traits can develop as a response to severe early trauma. We'll examine what happens to the brain when a child experiences chronic abuse and how that damage can manifest later in life. The second case will explore a different kind of childhood damage, not abandonment, but distorted attachment. What happens when the primary caregiver is both the source of comfort and the source of confusion? When love and abuse become tangled together in ways a child's mind can't untangle? The third case will confront something uncomfortable: the limits of what we can know. When someone claims childhood trauma, how do we verify it? What happens when the evidence conflicts? And what does that uncertainty mean for our understanding of how violence develops? These aren't easy questions, and I don't have easy answers, but thinking about them matters. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and let's begin. Let's start with a concept: secondary psychopathy. You've probably heard the word psychopath before. It gets thrown around a lot in movies and TV shows, in casual conversation. But clinically, researchers have noticed something interesting. Not all psychopaths are the same. Back in the 1940s, a psychiatrist named Benjamin Karpman started thinking about this. He was working with patients who showed psychopathic traits: the manipulation, the lack of remorse, the disregard for others. And he noticed that they seemed to fall into two different groups. The first group, there was something fundamentally different about them from the beginning. They seemed to lack certain emotional capacities from early childhood. Their psychopathy appeared to be innate, built into the hardware, so to speak. Karpman called this primary psychopathy. But the second group was different. These individuals also showed psychopathic traits. They also manipulated. They also lacked empathy. They also did terrible things. But when Karpman looked at their histories, he found trauma, severe, chronic, early trauma. Their psychopathy didn't seem innate. It seemed acquired, like something that developed in response to what had been done to them. Karpman called this secondary psychopathy. Let's think about this for a moment. The idea is that there might be two different roads to the same destination. One road is biological, genetic, neurological. Some people are simply born with brains that process emotion differently. Their amygdala doesn't respond normally to fear or distress. Their prefrontal cortex doesn't regulate impulses the way it should. These are the primary psychopaths. Their condition is rooted in neurology. But the second road is experiential, environmental, traumatic. Some people aren't born with deficits in emotional processing. They're born with normal brains, normal capacities for empathy and attachment. But then something happens. The environment they grow up in is so damaging, so relentlessly harmful, that their brain adapts, changes, rewires itself in response to chronic threat. And by the time they're adult, they look a lot like primary psychopaths. The emotional deficits are there, the lack of empathy is there, the capacity for violence is there. But the cause is different. Modern research has largely supported Karpman's insight. When researchers use Robert Hare's psychopathy checklist, the PCLR, to assess individuals, they find that the 20 traits fall into two broad factors. Factor 1 includes the emotional and interpersonal traits: the charm, the grandiosity, the lack of remorse. the shallow affect. Factor 2 includes the lifestyle and antisocial traits, the impulsivity, the poor behavioral controls, the criminal versatility. And here's what's interesting. Secondary psychopaths tend to score differently than primary psychopaths. They often score higher on factor 2, the impulsive, antisocial behaviors, but they also show something that primary psychopaths typically don't: emotional volatility, anxiety, depression, intense negative emotions that primary psychopaths seem to lack. Primary psychopaths feel very little. Secondary psychopaths feel intensely, often too intensely, but they've learned to channel those feelings in destructive ways, or they've learned to shut them down entirely. Why does this distinction matter? Because it suggests that extreme early trauma doesn't just hurt people emotionally, it can actually reshape how their brain functions, how they process information, how they relate to others, how they understand themselves. In the most severe cases, it can create something that looks very much like psychopathy, even if the underlying cause is completely different. Now let's talk about what chronic childhood trauma actually does to the developing brain, because this is where the research gets really interesting. When a child experiences stress, fear, threat, danger, their brain activates what's called the stress response system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis. This system releases cortisol and other stress hormones. It prepares the body for fight or flight. It's adaptive. It keeps us alive in dangerous situations. But here's the problem. The system is designed for acute stress, short-term threats that come and go. It's not designed for chronic stress, ongoing, relentless, inescapable threat. When a child lives in an environment where the danger never stops, where the abuse is daily, where the neglect is constant, where there's no safe haven, the HPA axis stays activated all the time, day after day, month after month, year after year, and this chronic activation changes the brain. Researchers like Martin Teicher at Harvard have used brain imaging to study adults who experience childhood abuse. What they've found is striking. The hippocampus, the part of the brain involved in memory and learning, often shows reduced volume. It's literally smaller in adults who were abused as children. The amygdala, and the part of the brain that processes fear and threat, can become hyperactive. It's always on alert, always scanning for danger. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, decision-making, and emotional regulation, can show impaired development, reduced connectivity with other brain regions. These aren't subtle changes. They're measurable, visible on scans, and they help explain why chronic childhood trauma has such profound effects on adult behavior. The brain has literally been shaped by the environment it developed in, an environment of constant threat. There's another concept we need to understand: attachment theory. This comes from the work of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth in the mid-20th century. The basic idea is this: humans are born helpless. We depend completely on our caregivers for survival, and because of this, we're biologically programmed to form attachments. The attachment bond between a child and their primary caregiver isn't just about physical care, it's about emotional regulation. When a baby is distressed, they cry. The caregiver responds, the baby calms down. Over time, through thousands of these interactions, the child learns something fundamental. They learn that the world is generally safe, that their needs will be met, that other people can be trusted, that they have value. This becomes what Bowlby called an internal working model, a template for how relationships work, a foundation for emotional development. When attachment is secure, children develop the ability to regulate their own emotions, to form healthy relationships, to navigate the social world. But when attachment is disrupted, when the caregiver is absent or neglectful, or worst of all, when the caregiver is actually a source of fear, the child develops what researchers call insecure attachment, and in the most severe cases, when the caregiver is both the source of comfort and the source of terror. The child develops disorganized attachment. This is the most damaging pattern, because the child faces an impossible situation. They're biologically driven to seek comfort from their caregiver, but their caregiver is the source of their fear. Approach and avoidance become tangled together. Safety and danger become confused, and the child's developing brain has no way to resolve the contradiction. Disorganized attachment in childhood is one of the strongest predictors of psychological problems in adulthood: depression, anxiety, personality disorders. Difficulty regulating emotions, difficulty forming healthy relationships. It's not destiny. Many people with disorganized attachment do okay, especially if they find other sources of security later in life. Other relationships that help repair the damage. But when disorganized attachment combines with other factors, chronic abuse, genetic vulnerability, no protective relationships, ongoing trauma into adolescence and beyond, the outcomes can be severe. Now, let's talk about Aileen Wuornos, because her case illustrates all of this. Not to excuse what she did, nothing excuses murder, but to understand the pathway, the developmental trajectory, how a human being can end up capable of things most of us can't imagine. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956 in Rochester, Michigan. She never met her father. His name was Leo Dale Pittman. By the time Aileen was born, he was already in prison. He had been convicted of kidnapping and raping a 7-year-old child. He would later be diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he would eventually hang himself in his prison cell when Aileen was 13. That's the father, a pedophile, a schizophrenic, a man who killed himself in prison. Aileen never knew him, but she inherited his genes, and she inherited his absence. Her mother was Diane Wuornos. 15 years old when Aileen was born, a child herself, Diane tried to raise Aileen and her older brother Keith. She tried for about 4 years, then she gave up. She abandoned both children with their maternal grandparents, Laurie and Britta Wuornos, and she disappeared from Aileen's life. Think about what this means for a developing mind. 4 years old. Your mother, the primary attachment figure, the source of whatever security you've managed to develop, leaves. Just leaves. Doesn't come back. You're handed to your grandparents, told to call them mom and dad. The people who were supposed to love you most in the world gave you away. What does that teach a child about relationships, about trust, about their own value? But it gets worse. The grandparents weren't a refuge. Laurie Wuornos was an alcoholic. He was also violent, and he was sexually abusing Aileen throughout her childhood. The grandfather, the man she was told to call dad, the person who was supposed to protect her. Court, documents, and clinical interviews later confirmed the abuse. Chronic, ongoing, inescapable. And Britta, the grandmother, was also an alcoholic. She was described in school records as punishing and rejecting. She didn't protect Aileen. She couldn't or wouldn't. So here's Aileen's situation. Abandoned by both biological parents, raised by alcoholic grandparents, sexually abused by her grandfather. No protection, no safe haven, no secure attachment to anyone. This is attachment trauma of the most severe kind. And it went on for years. By adolescence, Aileen was exchanging sex for food, cigarettes, and drugs. At age 14, she was raped by a friend of her grandfather's. She became pregnant from the rape. She was forced to give the baby up for adoption. Shortly after, her grandmother Britta died. Aileen was thrown out of the house. At 15 years old, she was homeless, living in the woods near her childhood home, surviving through prostitution. Think about that developmental trajectory. By 15, she had experienced abandonment by both parents, years of sexual abuse, rape resulting in pregnancy, forced separation from her child, homelessness, prostitution, no education, no support, no one. The only consistent thing in her life was harm. This is where Eric Hickey's trauma control model becomes relevant. Hickey is a criminologist who has studied how people become capable of serial violence. His model proposes that certain individuals have predispositional factors, genetics, early brain development, temperament, that make them vulnerable. But vulnerability isn't destiny. What tips the balance, according to Hickey, is trauma, especially early, chronic trauma. The trauma creates what he calls facilitators, coping mechanisms that help the person survive their circumstances but that can become destructive later. Substance abuse is a facilitator. It numbs the pain. Dissociation is a facilitator. It allows you to mentally escape what you can't, physically escape. Rage is a facilitator. It provides energy and focus when everything else feels hopeless. And fantasy can be a facilitator, imagining control when you have none, imagining power when you're powerless. These facilitators aren't inherently bad. They're survival mechanisms. They help abused children make it through childhood. But if they're never addressed, if the person never gets help, never develops healthier coping mechanisms, the facilitators can evolve, intensify, become the foundation for violence. Aileen Wuornos developed all of these facilitators, heavy substance abuse throughout her life, dissociative episodes documented in clinical evaluations, explosive rage that emerged in chaotic patterns, and a profound, generalized hostility toward men. That last one makes sense, doesn't it? Think about the men in her life. Father, pedophile, absent, suicide. Grandfather, her rapist. The family friend, another rapist. The countless men she encountered during years of prostitution, paying to use her body, sometimes violent, always transactional. She never experienced a positive relationship with a man, not once, not ever. So she learned something, not consciously, not as a decision, just as a deep, embodied understanding. Men are dangerous. Men hurt you. Men use you. And eventually, men deserve what they get. By her 30s, Aileen had accumulated a long history of arrests, assault, armed robbery, forgery, check fraud. She drifted through relationships, married briefly to a man in his 70s, but the marriage collapsed within a year. She met a woman named Tyria Moore. They became lovers. They became partners. For a little while, Aileen seemed to have found something like stability, but the damage was too deep, the patterns too entrenched. And in late 1989, something shifted. Between December 1989 and November 1990, Aileen Wuornos killed 7 men. All middle-aged, all shot with a .22 caliber pistol, all encountered during what began as prostitution transactions. Their bodies were found along central Florida highways. Their belongings were stolen. Wuornos would later claim that all 7 killings were self-defense, that each man had attacked her or raped her or tried to rape her. The forensic evidence was mixed. Some victims showed signs consistent with struggle, others didn't. Some were shot in ways that suggested close contact. Others were shot in the back. The pure self-defense narrative didn't hold up consistently. But here's where the psychology gets complicated. Remember what we discussed about the neurobiological effects of chronic trauma, the hyperactive amygdala, the impaired prefrontal cortex, the brain shaped by years of genuine danger. For someone with Aileen's history, the boundary between actual threat and perceived threat may have become blurred. Her nervous system was calibrated for danger, primed to detect threat, ready to respond in ambiguous situations that might be harmless, might be dangerous. Her brain defaulted to danger, and her response was violence. This doesn't justify homicide, it doesn't excuse it, but it helps explain how she could genuinely believe she was defending herself. Even in situations where the objective threat was unclear, her subjective experience of threat was shaped by decades of real victimization. The world really had been dangerous for her. Men really had hurt her again and again and again. So when she perceived danger, even if that perception was distorted by her trauma, she responded the way her brain had learned to respond, with lethal force. When forensic psychiatrists evaluated Aileen Wuornos, they found a complicated picture. She scored 32 on the PCLR. That's well above the threshold of 30 typically used to diagnose psychopathy. She met criteria for borderline personality disorder, a condition strongly associated with early attachment trauma. She met criteria for antisocial personality disorder, and she showed signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. The researchers who studied her case concluded that her violence resulted from a confluence of early childhood attachment disruptions, severe psychopathy, other personality disorder pathology, and traumagenic abuse history. That word, confluent, is important. No single factor caused Aileen Wuornos to become a killer. It was the combination, the accumulation, the layering of damage upon damage, from birth through adulthood. She had possible genetic vulnerabilities, her father's schizophrenia, his criminal history. She had severe attachment disruption, abandoned by both parents before age 4. She had chronic trauma, years of sexual abuse, rape, homelessness, prostitution. She had no protective factors, no secure relationships, no education, no support, no intervention. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And by the time she was an adult, the damage was too deep to repair. Aileen Wuornos was executed on October 9, 2002. In her final interviews, she made strange claims. She talked about sonic pressure, shadow entities, mind control. Some have interpreted this as psychotic deterioration. Others note that she had always been prone to fantastical claims. That distinguishing truth from fabrication had always been difficult with her. What we can say with confidence is this: Aileen Wuornos represents a case study in what happens when every protective factor fails. Children can survive difficult childhoods. They do it every day, but they need something: one secure attachment, one person who believes in them, one experience of being valued. Aileen had none of that. And by the time anyone might have helped, it was too late. Take a breath. That was heavy. Let it settle. You don't need to hold on to all of it. Just let your mind absorb what it needs to absorb. When you're ready, we'll look at a very different case. A different childhood, a different kind of damage, a different pathway to violence. There's no rush. Let's start with something strange, something that challenges our usual understanding of abuse and its effects. Most of the time, when we talk about childhood trauma, we're talking about absence, neglect, abandonment, a lack of what children need, or we're talking about clear-cut abuse, violence that's obviously harmful, sexual abuse that's clearly wrong. But what happens when the damage is more complicated? What happens when the abuser is also the primary attachment figure? When the source of fear is also the source of comfort? When love and abuse become so tangled together that the child can't separate them? This is a different kind of psychological injury, and it creates different kinds of problems. Let's think about a child's situation. Every child needs attachment. It's biological, hardwired. You can't choose not to attach to your caregivers. The drive is automatic. So what happens when your primary caregiver, usually your mother, is also harming you? You can't stop needing her. You can't stop seeking comfort from her. You're biologically programmed to attach, but she's also the source of your fear, your pain, your confusion. This creates what some researchers call a fright without solution. The child is caught in an impossible bind. Approach the caregiver for comfort. Experience more distress. Avoid the caregiver. Lose the only source of comfort available. There's no escape, no resolution, no way out. And the child's developing mind has to find some way to cope with this impossible situation. One way children cope is through something called identification with the aggressor. This concept comes from Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter, who became an important psychologist in her own right. Here's how it works. When a child is being hurt by someone more powerful, they feel helpless, terrified, overwhelmed. These feelings are unbearable. So the mind finds a way to escape them. Instead of identifying with the victim, which would mean continuing to feel helpless, and the child identifies with the aggressor, they mentally align themselves with the powerful one, the one in control. This provides psychological relief. Instead of feeling weak, they feel strong. Instead of feeling afraid, they feel powerful. But it comes at a cost. The child internalizes the aggressor's perspective. They learn that power and dominance are the solution to feeling vulnerable. And they may grow up to become aggressive themselves, not despite the abuse they suffered. Because of it, there's another phenomenon worth understanding: the confusion of sexual arousal with other emotions. Children's brains are developing. Their emotional systems are forming. The associations being built during childhood become foundational. When a child experiences inappropriate sexual contact from a caregiver, several things get tangled together that shouldn't be tangled. Safety and danger, love and violation, comfort and fear, and sometimes arousal and aggression. The child doesn't understand what's happening. They don't have the framework to separate appropriate from inappropriate, normal from abnormal. They just absorb the experience. And the experience shapes how their brain connects things. This is how deviant sexual interests can develop, not through choice, not through moral failing, through early experiences that created associations the conscious mind never chose. Now, let's talk about Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, the most prolific serial murderer in American history, by confirmed body count. His case illustrates something different from Aileen Wuornos. Not abandonment, not homelessness, not the absence of family, but the presence of a specific kind of damage that came from his primary attachment figure, his mother. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. His family wasn't poor, they weren't homeless. They moved to Washington State when Gary was young and settled in SeaTac, a working-class neighborhood near Seattle. From the outside, the Ridgways looked ordinary. Father Thomas worked as a bus driver. Mother Mary Rita worked at a department store. 3 sons. Gary was the middle one. Nothing obviously wrong, but inside that house, something toxic was developing. Mary Rita Ridgway was a domineering, controlling presence. She ran the household, she made the rules, and she enforced them with violence. She would hit her sons with belts and sticks for minor infractions. She would hit her husband too. There are accounts of her smashing plates over Thomas's head while he sat passively, absorbing the abuse without retaliation. But the physical violence wasn't the worst of it. The worst was something else, something that happened around Gary's bedwetting. Gary Ridgway wet the bed until he was 13 or 14 years old. This is not uncommon. Lots of children struggle with bedwetting. It usually resolves on its own. But Mary Rita's response to the bedwetting was not normal. After each incident, she would force Gary to strip naked. Then she would bathe him. She would wash his genitals. While he stood there, naked, a teenager, and she, often partially clothed herself, cleaned him with her hands, in front of his brothers sometimes, humiliating him, shaming him, and touching him in ways that were completely inappropriate for his age. Think about what this does to a developing mind. The person who is supposed to be safe, your mother, is also the person creating sexual confusion, physical humiliation, and psychological distress, and it's happening during adolescence, when sexual development is already confusing, when the brain is forming its templates for arousal, for relationships, for intimacy. The associations being built are all wrong. Mother, sexual contact, humiliation, arousal, confusion, anger, love and violation tangled together, comfort and fear fused, intimacy and shame connected in ways that can't be easily separated. Gary Ridgway would later admit in psychological evaluations that he developed sexual feelings toward his mother during this period, and that these feelings were accompanied by intense rage. He fantasized about killing her. He thought about it, imagined it, wanted it, but he never acted on it. Instead, the rage went somewhere else. Let's talk about the McDonald triad. In 1963, a psychiatrist named John McDonald published a paper suggesting that 3 childhood behaviors might predict adult violence: bedwetting past an appropriate age, fire setting, and cruelty to animals. The triad has been controversial. Later research has shown it's not as predictive as McDonald initially thought. But it's interesting that Gary Ridgway showed all 3 behaviors, the bedwetting we've discussed. He also set fires as a child. And he killed animals. He locked a cat in a refrigerator and watched it die. He described feeling a thrill, an excitement. These early behaviors suggest something was already wrong. Something in his emotional development was veering off course. Whether that was genetic predisposition, environmental factors, or some combination, we can't know for certain. But the warning signs were there. There's another early incident worth noting. When Gary Ridgway was around 16 years old, he encountered a young boy, a 6-year-old, in the woods near his home. He lured the boy with him, and then he stabbed him, unprovoked, for no apparent reason. He just stabbed a child. The boy survived, barely. The knife penetrated his liver. But here's the disturbing part. Nothing happened. The incident was reported, but police didn't pursue it seriously. No charges were filed. Ridgway faced no consequences. He had just stabbed a child for no reason, and he got away with it. What lesson did that teach him? As Ridgway grew into adulthood, patterns emerged. He married 3 times. All 3 marriages were marked by his unusual sexual demands. He wanted sex constantly, multiple times a day. He wanted it in public places. He wanted dominance, control. His second wife, Marcia, described how he would choke her during arguments. Not playfully, aggressively, the way he would later strangle his victims. She divorced him. He also began frequenting prostitutes, obsessively, despite his marriages, despite his claims of religious devotion. His father, Thomas, had complained about prostitutes on his bus route. had talked about them with disgust. Gary seems to have absorbed a strange mixture of fascination and contempt. These were women who existed outside normal society, women who could be used and discarded, women who, in his developing psychology, deserved what happened to them. In 1982, Gary Ridgway began killing. His first confirmed victim was 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield, a runaway, a vulnerable young woman working as a prostitute. Her body was found in the Green River near Seattle. Over the next 2 decades, Ridgway would kill at least 49 women, possibly as many as 80. His method was consistent. He would pick up women along Highway 99, the strip where prostitutes worked. He would show them pictures of his son, make small talk, seem harmless. Then he would strangle them. Afterward, he would dump their bodies in remote locations, wooded areas along the river. And sometimes, this is disturbing but important for understanding the psychology, he would return to the bodies afterward to have sex with them. This behavior is called necrophilia, sexual attraction to corpses. It's rare, and it's deeply connected to issues of power and control. Living people have will. They can resist, they can refuse, they can leave. Dead people can't do any of that. They're completely passive, completely controllable. For someone whose early experiences created a toxic association between intimacy and power, between sexuality and dominance, between closeness and control. Necrophilia represents the ultimate expression, complete power over another person, no resistance possible. Ridgway was eventually caught in 2001 when advances in DNA technology allowed police to match evidence from the crimes to a sample he had provided years earlier. He confessed to 48 murders, then more, then claimed the number might be 70 or 80. He said he killed because he hated prostitutes, because he wanted to eliminate them, because he saw himself as doing something almost righteous. He showed no remorse. When families of victims confronted him at his sentencing hearing, his face remained blank. He couldn't understand their pain, or maybe he understood it intellectually but felt nothing about it. Either way, the emotional connection, the empathy that would let him feel what they felt, was absent. What does Gary Ridgway teach us about the making of a psychopath? Several things. First, that trauma can take forms other than physical violence or abandonment. Ridgway wasn't beaten to the extent that some abuse victims are. He wasn't abandoned. He wasn't homeless. But the psychological damage was profound. The inappropriate sexual contact with his mother, the humiliation, the confusion of love and sexuality and anger. These created a template for relationships that was fundamentally distorted. Second, that maternal relationships matter enormously. The mother-child bond is typically the primary attachment relationship. When that relationship is damaged, when the mother is both the source of comfort and the source of confusion, the effects can be devastating. Ridgway's hatred of prostitutes may have been, at some level, displaced hatred of his mother. These were women who reminded him of her, women who were sexual, women who could be controlled. By killing them, he may have been symbolically killing the part of himself that felt vulnerable to his mother's abuse, or killing her over and over again in the only way he could. Third, that warning signs can appear early. The bedwetting, the fire setting, the animal cruelty, the stabbing of a 6-year-old. All of these happened in childhood or adolescence. All of them were overlooked or minimized. What if someone had paid attention? What if Ridgway had received intervention as a teenager? We can't know if it would have changed anything, but we can know that the signals were there. And no one responded to them. Gary Ridgway is still alive. He's serving multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. In prison, he's reportedly quiet, cooperative, a model inmate, just another older man shuffling through his days. But inside his mind, whatever damaged thing was built there in childhood, whatever associations were formed, whatever template was created, it's still there. It doesn't go away. Take a moment. Let that settle. We've looked at 2 very different pathways now. Aileen Wuornos, abandonment, chaos, obvious abuse, the complete absence of protection. Gary Ridgway, a more subtle damage, within an intact family from a confused and inappropriate relationship with his mother. Both ended in serial murder. Different roads, same destination. Our final case is different again. It asks a harder question. What happens when we don't know what's true? When the claims conflict with the evidence? when the killer's story doesn't match reality? What can we really know about why someone becomes what they become? Rest for a moment, then we'll continue. Let's think about something that most discussions of criminal psychology don't like to admit. Sometimes we don't know. We have theories, we have frameworks, we have patterns that seem to repeat. But in individual cases, the truth can be murky, the evidence can conflict, the stories can change, and we're left with uncertainty. This is uncomfortable. We want answers. We want to understand why people do terrible things. But sometimes the honest answer is, we're not sure. And that uncertainty itself teaches us something important about the limits of psychological understanding. Arthur Shawcross presents exactly this kind of case. He was a serial killer, that much is certain. He killed at least 2 children in the 1970s. He served time for it. He was released. And then he killed at least 11 more people, mostly women, in the late 1980s. The crimes are documented. The victims are real. But when we ask why, when we try to understand his childhood, his development, the pathway that led him to violence, we run into problems because Shawcross told stories, lots of stories, and many of them appear to be lies. Let's start with what Shawcross claimed about his childhood. He said his mother sexually abused him, that she would insert objects into his body, that she molested him from a young age. He said his aunt gave him oral sex when he was 9 years old. He said he had sexual relations with his sister as a teenager. He said he was bullied and isolated and traumatized. This would be a horrific childhood, the kind of childhood that, according to everything we've discussed, could contribute to later violence. But there's a problem. His parents denied all of it. His siblings denied all of it. There's no corroborating evidence, no witnesses, no documentation. And Shawcross's stories changed. This is something forensic psychiatrists who evaluated him noticed repeatedly. His stories weren't consistent. In one interview, he would describe an abusive incident one way. In the next interview, he would describe it differently. Details would change. The severity would change. Sometimes the incidents would disappear entirely and be replaced by different ones. This isn't how genuine trauma memories typically work. Real memories have some consistency. They might be incomplete or distorted, but the core elements tend to remain stable. When someone's stories change dramatically between tellings, when the details shift depending on who's asking and what they seem to want to hear, that's a red flag for fabrication or confabulation, genuinely believing false memories, or both. One psychiatrist who spent considerable time evaluating Shawcross was Richard Krauss. Krauss approached Shawcross with genuine curiosity. He wanted to understand. He conducted extensive interviews. And after all that evaluation, here's what Krauss concluded. Shawcross was deceptive, muddled, sociopathic, sane, not suffering from PTSD, prone to making up stories that changed dramatically in detail, unlikely to have been a victim of child abuse, and not significantly brain damaged. That's a devastating assessment, not a traumatized child who grew into a killer, a liar who made up whatever story he thought might help him. But wait, another expert disagreed. Dr. Dorothy Lewis, a prominent psychiatrist who has studied many violent criminals, evaluated Shawcross for his trial. She came to very different conclusions. Lewis believed Shawcross did suffer from brain damage. She pointed to a cyst on his temporal lobe and scarring on his frontal lobe, regions associated with impulse control and decision-making. She believed he might have a seizure disorder. She believed he may have suffered genuine childhood abuse. And most controversially, she believed he had developed dissociative identity disorder, what used to be called multiple personality disorder. She testified that Shawcross would dissociate during his crimes, that an alternate personality would take over, that he wasn't fully responsible for his actions. Here we have two experts looking at the same person and reaching completely different conclusions. Krauss, a lying sociopath with no genuine trauma history. Lewis, a brain-damaged, traumatized individual with a dissociative disorder. How can they both be looking at the same person? The answer lies in how the evaluations were conducted, and in what we can and cannot know about the human mind. Lewis's evaluation included something controversial: hypnosis. She placed Shawcross under hypnosis and attempted to uncover earlier traumas that might have caused his violence. Under hypnosis, Shawcross described his mother's abuse in graphic detail. An alternate personality emerged. He called her Bessie. It seemed like powerful evidence for Lewis's theory. But here's the problem with hypnosis. It doesn't reliably recover buried memories. What it does is make people highly suggestible. People under hypnosis are more likely to produce whatever response they think the hypnotist wants. They confabulate, create false memories that feel genuine. They elaborate on suggestions, building entire narratives from tiny prompts. Courts have largely rejected hypnotically recovered memories as evidence precisely because they're so unreliable. So was Bessie a real alternate personality that emerged under hypnosis, or was she a construction? Something Shawcross created because he sensed that's what Lewis was looking for. We can't know for certain. The jury in Shawcross's trial wasn't convinced by the dissociative disorder defense. They deliberated for just half an hour before finding him guilty. He was sentenced to 250 years in prison. He died there in 2008 of a heart attack at age 63. But here's what makes this case instructive. We're left with genuine uncertainty. Did Shawcross experience childhood abuse? His stories suggest yes, but his stories changed, and his family denied everything. Maybe they were lying. Families often deny abuse, especially after the fact, especially when it reflects badly on them. Or maybe Shawcross was lying, creating a narrative that might generate sympathy or explain his crimes, or serve some other purpose only he understood. We can't know which is true. Did Shawcross have brain damage that contributed to his violence? Lewis pointed to the cyst and the scarring, but other experts noted that Shawcross didn't show clear evidence of impaired functioning in his daily life. He held jobs, he married, he maintained relationships. If his brain damage was significant enough to cause serial murder, why didn't it affect his ability to function in other areas? Again, we can't know for certain. Did he have a dissociative disorder? Under hypnosis, an alternate personality appeared. But hypnosis is unreliable. The emergence of Bessie may have been performance or suggestion or confabulation. And Shawcross was too organized, too methodical, too careful about avoiding detection to fit the typical profile of someone acting in dissociative states. The jury didn't believe it. But does that mean it wasn't real? Or does it mean they didn't have the framework to understand it? Or does it mean Shawcross was a skilled manipulator who created Bessie when he realized it might help his defense? Again, uncertainty. This is uncomfortable. We want to understand why people do terrible things. We want explanations that make sense. We want to believe that if we just gather enough information, we can figure it out. But Arthur Shawcross reminds us that the human mind is opaque, even with extensive psychiatric evaluation, even with brain imaging, even with detailed interviews. We can't always know what's really going on inside another person, and we can't always trust what they tell us. What can we say about Shawcross? Some things seem likely. He probably had some form of personality disorder. The manipulation, the lack of remorse, the ability to function normally in some contexts while killing in others. These point toward antisocial or psychopathic traits. He may have had some neurological abnormalities. Whether they were significant enough to affect his behavior is unclear, but something seems to have been atypical about his brain. He may have experienced some form of childhood trauma. Even if his specific stories were fabricated or exaggerated, the fact that he gravitated toward those narratives might suggest something real underneath, something he couldn't or wouldn't articulate directly. But we can't know for certain, and that uncertainty is itself the lesson. Psychology has made enormous progress in understanding violence. We know about attachment theory, about the neurobiology of trauma, about the developmental pathways that can lead to psychopathy. These frameworks are valuable. They help us make sense of cases that would otherwise be incomprehensible. But they're not perfect. They don't explain every case. They can't always distinguish truth from fabrication. They leave room for uncertainty. And that's okay, because science is honest about what it doesn't know. And psychology, for all its advances, is still a young science, still learning, still uncertain about many things. What Arthur Shawcross teaches us is humility. Humility about our ability to understand why people do what they do. Humility about the reliability of self-report. humility about the limits of expert evaluation. We can study these cases, we can identify patterns, we can build frameworks, but we can't always know the truth, and pretending we can is its own kind of error. Let yourself rest. That was the last case. 3 childhoods, 3 pathways, 3 windows into the question of how psychopaths are made. Take a breath, let it all settle. When you're ready, we'll bring it together. So, are psychopaths born or made? After everything we've explored tonight, here's the honest answer: it depends. Some individuals seem to have innate neurological differences that predispose them to psychopathy, reduced amygdala function, atypical prefrontal development. These differences appear early and persist throughout life. For these individuals, the primary psychopaths, genetics and neurology play the dominant role. Environment shapes how the traits express themselves, but the core deficits are built in. Other individuals seem to acquire psychopathic traits in response to trauma. Severe, chronic, early trauma that reshapes the developing brain. That creates the same functional deficits through damage rather than inheritance. For these individuals, the secondary psychopaths, environment plays the dominant role. The person they might have been with a different childhood is unknowable, but the person they became was shaped by what was done to them. And for some individuals, we genuinely don't know. The evidence is unclear. The stories conflict. The truth is hidden behind layers of fabrication, confabulation, and uncertainty. What we can say is this: childhood matters. It matters enormously. The experiences a child has in those first years, the relationships, the attachments, the presence or absence of safety, shape the brain in fundamental ways, not deterministically. Many people survive terrible childhoods and live good lives. But the risk factors are real. Abuse increases the likelihood of later problems. Neglect increases the likelihood of later problems. Disrupted attachment increases the likelihood of later problems. And when these factors combine, when abuse and neglect and disrupted attachment and genetic vulnerability all come together in the same child, the outcomes can be catastrophic. Tonight, we looked at 3 cases. Aileen Wuornos showed us what happens when every protective factor fails: abandoned, abused, homeless, surviving through prostitution. She never had a chance to become anything else. Gary Ridgway showed us how subtle damage within an intact family can still warp development. His mother's inappropriate intimacy created associations that became lethal. Arthur Shawcross showed us the limits of what we can know. His truth remains hidden, even from the experts who studied him closely. Different pathways, different childhoods, different degrees of certainty about what actually happened, but all leading to terrible outcomes. Understanding these pathways isn't about excusing violence. Nothing excuses what these individuals did. Their victims, dozens of them, were real people with real lives that were taken from them. Understanding is about prevention, about recognizing warning signs, about intervening early, about giving children the safety and attachment they need so they don't grow into something else. Every serial killer was once a child. And in that childhood, for most of them, we can see the damage accumulating if we can see it, if we can recognize it, if we can respond to it. Maybe we can prevent what comes next. That's what the research is for. That's what these case studies teach us. Not fascination with evil, but understanding of how evil develops, so it can be stopped. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. It's been heavy material, hard to think about, hard to sit with, but important. You can let it go now. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. Let your breathing slow down. Let the weight of these stories lift from you. You're safe, you're comfortable, you're exactly where you need to be. The world outside can wait until morning. For now, just rest. Sleep well. This has been Late Night Psychology. Until next time.